Hello everybody, this is Robert again, and we're going to continue our readings with Neal Stephenson's In the Beginning Was the Command Line. This will be part 2 of our readings, and I'll read maybe several chapters and we'll take it from there. So with that in mind, sit back, relax, and let us begin. We begin with the next chapter, GUIs, or Graphic User Interface. Now, the first job that any coder needs to do when writing a new piece of software is to figure out how to take that information that is being worked with in graphics program, an image, and a spreadsheet, a grid of numbers, and turn it into a linear string of bytes. These strings of bytes are commonly called files, or somewhat more hiply, streams. They are to telegrams what modern humans are to Cro-Magnon man, which is to say, the same thing under a different name. All that you see on your computer screen, your Tomb Raider, your digitized voicemail messages, faxes, and word processing documents written in 37 different typefaces is still, from the computer's point of view, just like telegrams, except much longer and demanding of more arithmetic. The quickest way to get a taste of this is to fire up your web browser, visit a site on the net, and then select the View Document Source menu item. You will get a bunch of computer codes that look something like this. Which follows is a bunch of HTML text that is hard to read over the audio, so I'm going to insert an image on the screen for you to see for yourself. This CRUD is called HTML, Hypertext Markup Language. And it is basically a very simple programming language instructing your web browser how to draw a page on a screen. Anyone can learn HTML, and many people do. The important thing is that no matter what splendid multimedia web pages they might represent, HTML files are just telegrams. When Ronald Reagan was a radio announcer, he used to call baseball games that he did not physically attend by reading the terse descriptions that trickled in over the telegraph wire and were printed out on a paper tape. He would sit there all by himself in a padded room with a microphone, and the paper tape would creep out of the machine and crawl over the palm of his hand, printed with cryptic abbreviations. And the count went to 3 and 2, and Reagan would describe the scene as if it was in his mind's eye. The brawny left-hander steps out of the batter's box to wipe the sweat from his brow. The umpire steps forward to sweep the dirt from home plate, and so on. When the cryptogram on the paper tape announced a base hit, he would whack the edge of the table with a pencil, creating a little sound effect, and describe the arc of the ball as if he could actually see it. His listeners, many of whom presumably thought that Reagan was actually at the ballpark watching the game, would reconstruct the scene in their minds according to his descriptions. My own personal love affair with the Macintosh began in the spring of 1984 in a computer store in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, when a friend of mine, coincidentally the son of the MGB owner, showed me a Macintosh running Mac Paint, the revolutionary drawing program. It ended in July of 1995 when I tried to save a big important file on my Macintosh PowerBook, and instead of doing so, it annihilated the data so thoroughly that 2 different disk crash utility programs were unable to find any trace that had ever existed. During the intervening 10 years, I had a passion for the Mac OS, and it seemed righteous and reasonable at the time, but in retrospect strikes me as being exactly the same sort of goofy infatuation that my friend's dad had with his car. It is commonly the case with technologies that you can get the best insight about how they work by watching them fail. When everything went to hell and the CPU began spewing out random bits, the results on a CLI machine was lines and lines of perfectly formed but random characters on the screen, known to the cognoscenti. And even after the introduction of Windows, the underlying differences endured. When a Windows machine got into trouble, the old command line interface would fall down over the GUI like an asbestos fire curtain sealing off the proscenium of a burning opera. When a Macintosh got into trouble, it presented you with a cartoon of a bomb, which was funny the first time you saw it. These were by no means superficial differences. The reversion of Windows to a CLI when it was in distress, proved to Mac partisans that Windows was nothing more than a cheap facade, like a garish Afghan flung over a rotten-out sofa. They were disturbed and annoyed by the sense that lurking underneath Windows' ostensibly user-friendly interface was literally a subtext. For their part, Windows fans might have made the sour observation that all computers, even Macintoshes, were built on the same subtext, and that the refusal of Mac owners to admit that fact to themselves seemed to signal a willingness, almost an eagerness, to be duped. Anyway, a Macintosh had to switch individual bits in the memory chips on the video card, and it had to do it very fast and in arbitrary, complicated patterns. Nowadays, this is cheap and easy, but in the technological regime that prevailed in the early 1980s, the only realistic way to do it was to build the motherboard, which contained the CPU, and the video system, which contained the memory that was mapped onto the screen, as a tightly integrated whole, hence the single, hermetically sealed case that made the Macintosh so distinctive. Next chapter, class struggle on the desktop. Now that the third rail has been firmly grasped, it is worth reviewing some basic facts here. Like any other publicly traded for-profit corporation, Microsoft has, in effect, borrowed a bunch of money from some people, its stockholders, in order to be in the bit business. As an officer of that corporation, Bill Gates has only one responsibility, which is to maximize return to investment. He has done this incredibly well. Any actions taken in the world of Microsoft, any software released by them, for example, are basically eponymia, which can't be interpreted or understood except insofar as they reflect Bill Gates' execution of his one and only responsibility. It follows that if Microsoft sells goods that are aesthetically unappealing, or that they don't work well, it does not mean that they are, respectively, Philistines or half-wits. It is because Microsoft's excellent management has figured out that they can make more money for their stockholders, by releasing stuff with obvious known imperfections than they can by making it beautiful or bug-free. This is annoying, but in the end, not half so annoying as watching Apple inscrutably and relentlessly destroy itself. Hostility towards Microsoft is not difficult to find on the net, and it blends two strains: resentful people who feel Microsoft is too powerful, and disdainful people who think it's tacky. This is all strongly reminiscent of the heyday of communism and socialism, when the bourgeoisie were hated from both ends, by the proles, because they had all the money, and by the intelligentsia, because of their tendency to spend it on lawn ornaments. Microsoft is the very embodiment of modern high-tech prosperity. It is, in a word, bourgeoisie, and so it attracts all the same gripes. Even the hardware that Windows ran on, when compared to the machines put out by Apple, looked like white trash stuff, and still mostly does. The reason was that Apple was and is a hardware company, while Microsoft was and is a software company. Apple therefore had a monopoly on hardware, and they could run Mac OS, whereas Windows-compatible hardware came out of a free market. The free market seems to have decided that people will not pay for cool-looking computers. PC hardware makers who hire designers to make their stuff look distinctive get their clocks cleaned by Taiwanese clone makers, punching out boxes that look as if they belong on cinder blocks in front of someone's trailer. Apple, on the other hand, could make their hardware as pretty as they wanted to and simply pass the higher prices on to their besotted customers, like me. Only last week, I am writing this sentence in early January 1999, the technology sections of all newspapers were fitted with adultery press coverage of how Apple had released the iMac in several happening new colors like blueberry and tangerine. Apple has always insisted on having a hardware monopoly, except for a brief period in the mid-1990s when they allowed clone makers to compete with them. The charitable explanation is that the hardware monopoly policy reflected a drive on Apple's part to provide a seamless, unified blending of hardware, operating system, and software. There is something to this. It is hard enough to make an OS that works well on one specific piece of hardware, designed and tested by engineers who work down the hallway from you in the same company. making an OS to work on arbitrary pieces of hardware, cranked out by rapidly entrepreneur clone makers on the other side of the international date line is very difficult and accounts for much of the trouble people have using Windows. The financial explanation is that Apple, unlike Microsoft, is and always has been a hardware company. It simply depends on revenue from selling hardware and cannot exist without it. In any event, as of 1987, both Mac OS and Windows were out on the market, running on hardware platforms that were radically different from each other. Not only in the sense that Mac OS used Motorola CPU chips, while Windows used Intel, but in the sense then overlooked but in the long run vastly more significant that the Apple hardware business was a rigid monopoly and the Windows side was churning free-for-all. But the full ramifications of this did not become clear until very recently. In fact, they are still unfolding in remarkably strange ways, as I'll explain when we get to Linux. The upshot is that millions of people got accustomed to using GUIs in one form or another. By doing so, they made Apple/Microsoft a lot of money. The fortunes of many people have become bound up with the ability of these companies to continue selling products whose saleability is very much open to question. So before continuing to the next chapter, I just want to make a few comments. I find this very interesting. This was written in 1999, right? This is when Steve Jobs just came back a couple years before. The company was still iffy about its future prospects because it was on the verge of bankruptcy when Steve Jobs came back, so nobody was really sure what was going to happen with it. And it was the underdog. And part of the marketing from the 80s on up was how Windows and Microsoft was like the big evil empire, and Apple was for the rebel, the free thinker. But something that's true, I like Apple as I record this. In fact, I'm recording this on a MacBook Pro. But it is not open boxes like Windows. Yes, they have a monopoly on the hardware and even the software, right? You can't take your software like a Mac OS and put it on a homebrew computer. That's called a Hackintosh. Most people can't do that. So normally can't. But nonetheless, that was the image they stuck with. And what I find so ironic, and that's why I love reading books about this stuff. Love reading the history of this. Apple is now like the evil empire in the minds of many people. Apple, while many people do buy their products, are kind of like the bourgeoisie. They're buying it as part of the silent majority. But really, by others, they're also viewed as the evil empire. They're part of the big tech, right? So it's just very good. All right, let's go to our next chapter. Nothing is more disagreeable to the hacker than duplication of effort. The first and most important mental habit that people develop when they learn how to write computer programs is to generalize. To make their code as modular and flexible as possible, breaking large problems down into small subroutines that can be used over and over again in different contexts. Subsequently, the development of operating systems, despite being technically unnecessary, was inevitable. Because at its heart, an operating system is nothing more than a library containing the most commonly used code, written once and hopefully written well, and then made available to every coder who needs it. So, a proprietary, closed, secret operating system is a contradiction in terms. It goes against the whole point of having an operating system, and it's impossible to keep them secret anyway. The source code, the original lines of text written by the programmers, can be kept secret, but an OS as a whole is a collection of small subroutines that do very specific, very clearly defined jobs. Exactly what those subroutines do has to be made public, quite explicitly and exactly, or else the OS is completely useless to programmers. They can't make use of those subroutines if they don't have a complete and perfect understanding of what the subroutines do. The only thing that isn't made public is exactly how the subroutines do what they do. But once you know what a subroutine does, it's generally quite easy, if you are a hacker, to write one of your own that does exactly the same thing. It might take a while, and it is tedious and unrewarding, but in most cases, it's not really hard. What's hard in hacking, as in fiction, is not the writing, it's deciding what to write. And the vendors and commercial OSs have already decided and published their decisions. This has been generally understood for a long time. MS-DOS was duplicated functionally by a rival product written from scratch called Pro-DOS that did all the same things in pretty much the same way. In other words, another company was able to write code that did all the same things as MS-DOS and sell it at a profit. If you're using the Linux OS, you can get a free program called Wine, which is a Windows emulator. That is, you can open up a window on your desktop that runs Windows program. It means that a completely functional Windows OS has been recreated inside of Unix like a ship in a bottle, and Unix itself, which is a vastly more sophisticated than MS-DOS, has been built up from scratch many times over. Versions of it are sold by Sun, Hewlett-Packard, AT&T, Silicon Graphics, IBM, and others. People have, in other words, been rewriting basic OS code for so long that all the technology that constituted an operating system in the traditional pre-GUI sense of that phrase is now so cheap and common that it's literally free. Not only could Gates and Allen not sell MS-DOS today, they could not even give it away because much more powerful OSs are already being given away. Even the original Windows has become worthless, and that there is no point in owning something that can be emulated inside of Linux, which is in itself free. In this way of the OS business is very different from, say, the car business. Keep in mind that Apple's ability to monopolize its own hardware supply was once cited by learned observers as a great advantage over Microsoft. At the time, it seemed to place them in a much stronger position. In the end, it nearly killed them and may kill them yet. The problem for Apple was that most of the world's computer users end up owning cheaper hardware. But cheap hardware couldn't run Mac OS, and so these people switched to Windows. Replace hardware with operating systems and Apple with Microsoft, and you can see the same thing about to happen all over again. Microsoft dominates the OS market, which makes them money and seems like a great idea for now. But cheaper and better OSs are available, and they are grown popular in parts of the world that are not so saturated with computers as the US. 10 years from now, most of the world's computer users may end up owning these cheaper OSs. But these OSs do not, for the time being, run any Microsoft applications, and so these people will use something else. To put it more directly, every time someone decides to use a non-Microsoft OS, Microsoft OS division obviously loses a customer. But as things stand now, Microsoft's applications division loses a customer too. This is not such a big deal as long as almost everyone uses Microsoft OSs. But as soon as Windows market share begins to slip, the path starts to look pretty dismal for the people in Redmond. This argument could be countered by saying that Microsoft could simply recompile its applications to run under other OSs. But this strategy goes against most normal corporate instincts. Again, the case of Apple is instructive. When things started to go south for Apple, they should have ported their OS to cheap PC hardware. But they didn't. Instead, they tried to make the most of their brilliant hardware, adding new features and expanding the product line. But this only had the effect of making their OS more dependent on these special hardware features, which made it worse for them in the end. Likewise, when Microsoft's position in the OS world is threatened, their corporate instinct will tell them to pile more new features into their operating systems and then rejigger their software applications to exploit those special features. But this will only have the effect of making their applications dependent on an OS with declining market share and make it worse for them in the end. The operating system market is a death trap, a tar pit, a slough of despond. There are only two reasons to invest in Apple and Microsoft. Each of these companies is in what we would call a codependency relationship with their customers. The customers want to believe, and Apple and Microsoft know how to give them what they want. 2. Each company works very hard to add new features to their OSs, which works to secure customer loyalty, at least for a little while. Accordingly, most of the remainder of this chapter will be about those two topics. Okay, so let's take a moment to comment before going to the next chapter. Ah, yes. It's so interesting here. So it really is true. Back in the 90s, and well up to even the 2000s, like Microsoft very much was a software company. But as at the recording of this, things have changed. They're very much in the hardware. They have the Surface books, right? They have the Surface laptops, Surface Studio, blah blah blah. They've got their own products, and of course they make peripherals like mouses, keyboards, and stuff. They're very much in the hardware business, but it would be safe to say that software is still their driving factor. And I believe now Windows is kind of free. They've opened up and allowed Windows to be distributed more freely. They're not relying on that money that comes from selling that anymore. Apple is both in hardware and software. In fact, I should take that back. They're more into the ecosystem, which I guess is software. They're hardware, but it's their ecosystem, the software that powers it, that is their main thing. So things have changed with these companies. But it moves a lot faster. In various parts of our world, it is possible to go and visit rich fossil beds where skeletons lie piled upon skeleton, recent ones on top and more ancient ones below. In theory, they all go all the way back to the first single-celled organisms. And if you use your imagination a bit, you can understand that. If you hang around long enough, you'll become fossilized there too. And in time, some more advanced organism will become fossilized on top of you. The fossil record, the La Brea tar pit of software technology, is the internet. Anything that shows up there is free for the taking. Possibly illegal, but free. Executives at a company like Microsoft get used to the experience, unthinkable in other industries, of throwing millions of dollars into the development of new technology such as web browsers, and then seeing the same or equivalent software show up on the internet for free 2 years or a year or even just a few months later. By continuing to develop new technologies and add features onto their products, they can keep one step ahead of the fossilization process. But on certain days, they must feel like mammoths caught in La Brea, using all their energies to pull their feet over and over again out of the sucking hot tar that wants to cover and envelop them. Survival in this biosphere demands sharp tusks and heavy stomping feet at one end of the organization, and Microsoft famously has those. But trampling the other mammoths into the tar can only keep you alive for so long. The danger is that in their obsession with staying out of the fossil beds, these companies will forget about what lies above, the realm of new technology. In other words, they must hang on to their primitive weapons and crude competitive instincts, but also evolve powerful brains. This appears to be what Microsoft is doing with its research division, which has been hiring smart people right and left. Hence, I would mention that although I know and socialize with several people in that company's research division, we never talk about business issues, and I have little to no idea what the hell they are up to. I have learned much more about Microsoft by using the Linux operating system than I ever would have done by using Windows. Never mind how Microsoft used to make money. Today, it is making its money on a kind of temporal arbitrage. Arbitrage, in the usual sense, means to make money by taking advantage of differences in the price of something between different markets. So Apple and Microsoft shower new features upon their users almost daily in the hopes that a steady stream of genuine technical innovations combined with the "I want to believe" phenomenon will prevent their customers from looking across the road toward the cheaper and better OSs that are available to them. The question is whether this makes sense in the long run. If Microsoft is addicted to OSs as Apple is to hardware, then they will bet the whole farm on their OSs and tie all of their new applications and technology to them. Their continued survival will then depend on these two things: adding more features to their OSs so that customers will not switch to the cheaper alternatives, and maintaining the image that in some mysterious way gives those customers the feeling that they are getting something for their money. The latter is a truly strange and interesting cultural phenomenon. Okay, that ends it for this readings for today. I want to thank you all for joining me. Now, right now, we're roughly a third away from the book. Yeah, so in 2 readings, we've done 1/3 of the book. And so that'll be it until next time. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, bye.